Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this cool, cold Sunday afternoon. It's time for our regular Zoom seminar, and we have a great program today. And Mark Law, I don't know where he shows up on your screen, but he is there, and his wife's the electronic genius to make sure that he has everything ready. He's got a nice screen share for us to do. I'm Bob Totten, the Executive Director for Shoshone County Historical Society. I am pleased that this is about our 38th seminar that we've put on in the last 2.5 years, and this has worked real well due to the fact that COVID would not allow us to meet. We're going to be talking to Mark Law, who's going to be talking about the history of drugstores in Topeka, but also, I think, to some degree, what's gone on in the state. And this starts from approximately 1858 onward. But before we do that, I want to encourage you, if you're not already a member of the organization, that you can submit a $35 check to us to Post Office Box 2201, Topeka, Kansas, 66601. If you are a member and haven't renewed your membership, of course, we would like to have you do that, because we use this money to help defray the efforts that we do today and others before that. But let's get going before with that. Mark Law is a lifelong Topekan who's worked in the heating and cooling industry, and he's apparently gotten really enthralled with bottles, and maybe at one point in time we can have him show us all the bottles that he has there in the basement that he's collected throughout. But his local history stems from the fact that he worked in many of the old buildings in downtown Topeka, and I think you'll find what he has to say very interesting. And Mark and your wife Donna, thank you both for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, and let's hear what you have to tell us.
Thanks, Bob. Can you see my screen?
See your screen, and it's full screen. So I think, unless anybody else has any objections, this will work. Sometimes I don't always know what, I think I see it, but maybe somebody else doesn't. But I think it's fine.
Okay, we're good to go. Well, thanks for joining in, everybody. I hope this enlightens you today in regards to some of a piece of Topeka history that a lot of people are unaware of. So tresses, brushes, and balm. The Industrial Revolution in the United States brought about a very unique period in our of time in our country called the Victorian era. The Victorian era lasted from approximately 1837 to 1901. Our country was heavily influenced by other countries, cultures, and ethnicities during this period, primarily England, France, and Eastern Asia. It was a period of ideas and inventions. Many of those inventions pertained to antidotes and concoctions promising anything from youthfulness to curing baldness. With the French influence came lotions, perfumes, and topicals promising a youthful appearance or covering up BO, since not much bathing was taking place during this time. Balsams and balms were heralded as great treatments for the skin, such as rashes, acne, and most disorders that afflicted the pale skin of the era. Most of the balms contained camphor oils, animal or plant fats, perfumes that really only made most conditions worse. The Eastern Asian influence was primarily placed upon medicine and natural healing. With that came apparatuses that looked like something from a horror film. Most of those inventions, being well-meaning, often inflicted more pain and suffering than the actual ailment. One such item was the ever-popular hernia truss. And upon seeing a hernia truss, one might think of it as a device for torture. Many times it probably was torture, but it was presented as a way to hold your hernia in place and to alleviate pain. Leather, buckles, steel, and hard rubber probably were not the answer, but they still sold well as a cure. More often than not, surgery was not an option yet, as the first hernia surgeries were just starting to be performed. Many of the concoctions and apparatuses were introduced to the public by salesmen traveling from city to city and from door to door. Some referred to them as hucksters, snake oil salesmen, and the ever popular medicine show. With the advent of periodicals becoming popular during this era came ads that encouraged consumers to order direct from the supplier. It also allowed retail stores to order in large quantities to sell from their shelves with big markups and large profits. The retailers who profited the most from the mail order were drugstores, pharmacies, and apothecaries. The pharmacist or druggist had these items right in front of the consumer and could make recommendations that could be immediately met since he had the product on the shelf. Brushes were another popular item during this period and were heavily influenced by the French culture. The Rowley Brothers Drugstore, located at 6th and Kansas Avenue in Topeka, advertised brushes in this way: brushes, 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 Russian paint and varnish brushes, French piano and furniture feather dusters, hearth brushes and counter dusters, whitewash and scrub brushes, Pop's eyes for cleaning store windows, hair cloth and shoe brushes, tooth and nail brushes, 12,000 brushes, all kinds, at Rowley Brothers Drugstore. Drugstores were one of the few places for artists to purchase paint, canvas, and of course, brushes. Topeka was no different than any other city when it came to having the ever popular corner drugstore. Just as today, what pharmacy do we see on the corners? Walgreens and CVS. Both companies pay big money to be on the corner and usually across from one another, as they want to be across from one another. They say it increases business. Some of the items that would have been found in a drugstore 100 years ago would have been candy, tobacco, paint, oil, liquor, soap, perfume, sponges, patent medicines, prescription compounds, and of course, trusses, brushes, and balm. With the advent of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, there became a decline in the amount of patent medicines being manufactured without validation of their ingredients. Within a couple of years following 1906, the patent medicine industry was so well regulated that the false claims and advertising of the quack medicines started to fade away, but never to go completely away, as we see on late night television infomercials today. The Pure Food and Drug Act helped save the lives of many, if not thousands, of people taking unregulated medicines containing cocaine, heroin, and high alcohol content. You can see on this particular image the retail dealer of opium and coke, which was a local drugstore here in Topeka, clear up into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. You can see that June 30th, 1953. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething babies. Little did the public know back in the 1800s that Mrs. Winslow was responsible for more infant deaths than anything else during this period of history due to the narcotics in her soothing syrup. The buying public during this time had no way of knowing the background of the maker or the true contents of their product. They only had the recommendation of the druggist, the interesting names applied to the product, or the referral of a friend, neighbor, or family member. And many of the patent medicines were produced and sold as you see in this image: Dr. King's, Dr. James, Dr. Kilmer, Dr. Caldwell, and there may not have ever been any substantiation that they were actually truly a doctor. Many of the buildings that housed the drugstores in Topeka from the 1860s through the 1950s are still standing today. So we're going to take a look at some of those buildings and the history behind them. This image or picture postcard from 1905 is of Kansas Avenue looking north from 9th Street, which would have been in the Mills building at 9th and Kansas Avenue. Note that several of the buildings on the right-hand side of the image, which would have been the 800 block, are still standing today. So let's take a look at the stores on Kansas Avenue. 607 South Kansas Avenue. The last former business to be in that building, of course, was the Schlotsky's restaurant. But only 4 years following the founding of Topeka in 1854, L.C. Kerr arrived in Topeka and opened his drugstore business under the name of Kerr and Kellum. The first drugstore was located at 187 South Kansas Avenue. Now that's just a 3-digit address, if you think about it. That would have been where the Kansas River weir or dike is now, I guess. After the opening at 187 South Kansas, they soon moved to 607 South Kansas Avenue. Between 1858 and 1950, the business location changed hands 14 times. Following Kerr and Kellum, it was Leonard and Kellum Drug Company, Leonard and Stringham, T.L. Stringham, Stringham and Barnes, Barnes and Sim, Sim Brothers, Sim and Snyder, the Sim Drug Company, George W. Flad and Company, Flad and Company, Flad and Grubbs, George W. Flad, and Flad and Marsh. Ed Flad and John Marsh purchased the business in 1916 and eventually sold to D.L. Crum, formerly of Kansas City, ending the longest reign of the business in January of 1950 of 34 years. The drugstore retained the name until it closed in the late 1950s, ending a run of nearly 100 years of drugstores at this one location. 201 South Kansas Avenue. The current owner and business at this location is the H.T. Paul Company. This building is the largest of the drugstore buildings in Topeka and was constructed in 1871. The first business was owned by W.H. Peckham Druggist. Peckham was only in business for 1 year and sold his business to W.F. Baker and R.R. Brown. It was known at that time then as the Baker and Brown Drugstore. This was a corner drugstore on the busiest street in Topeka, and once again, it only lasted 1 year, as many of them did. In 1873, the enterprise was acquired by I.N. Neeland and Company, homeopathic pharmacy. Neeland operated as a retail and wholesale establishment and operated at this location until 1882. 600 South Kansas Avenue. The present building and business at this address is the Fidelity Bank. So as you see in this image on this picture postcard, to the far left, the Rowley brothers. This 3 to 4 buildings here on the left is where Fidelity State Bank is, their main bank, at 6th and Kansas Avenue. So from this image, you're looking straight south on Kansas Avenue. This corner serves as great significance in the history of Topeka drugstores because of its popularity. In 1868, Henry Rowley built his corner drugstore at the busiest intersection in Topeka. Along with his brothers, James P. Rowley, they operated Rowley Drugs for 2 years. In 1870, the name changed to Rowley Brothers Drugstore, along with a third partner and another brother, Robert Rowley, through 1894. The business operation is unclear during the years 1895 through 1900. The business directory in 1900 lists the business name as Rowley and Snow Druggists. James P. Rowley and Fred A. Snow, proprietors. The two partners ran the business until 1905. And prior to this partnership and following, Fred Snow had Snow Druggist at 3 different locations in Topeka: 523 Kansas, 1001 Kansas, and 501 West 10th. This image is of 732 South Kansas Avenue, and the most recent business in there was Lupita's. I do have seen there for about the last year a sign on the front that says Four Guys Bistro, but I don't think they've yet to open. In 1894, G.T. Overfield opened the Topeka Drug Company at this location. Prior to 1894, the Topeka Drug Company had been located at 187 Kansas Avenue. If you recall, I mentioned that address earlier as the first opened drugstore in Topeka, which was the Topeka Drug Company, and now located at 732 South Kansas. The Topeka Drug Company operated until 1899 when R.W. Squires purchased the company and renamed it the Squires Drugstore. Squires sold his interest to Edward T. Sim in 1900. If you recall the 607 Kansas Avenue address, Schlotsky's, well, the seventh business owner during that time period was the Sims brothers. So Edward partnered with his brother, W.T. Sim, and they moved the operation across the street and one block down to 607 South Kansas, where they remained in operation until 1904. This is 301 South Kansas Avenue, which is the southwest corner of 3rd and South Kansas Avenue. Current business at this address is the Sewing Workshop. This was also another significant corner drugstore, as it was one of only a few drugstores that had a specific listing in the city directory as a colored drugstore. Politically speaking, it was a drugstore that catered to the African-American population. It was known as the Shawnee Drug Company. Partners were James Harris and James White. First year of business was 1912, with no further listings in the city directories. The construction of this building dates to approximately 1868. 433 South Kansas Avenue. This space is currently vacant and listed by KS Commercial Real Estate. This is only one of two drugstores located right next door to another drugstore. From 1900 to 1907, Edward B. Walker operated the E.B. Walker Drugstore right next to the Brunt Drugstore, which was located at 435 South Kansas Avenue. So here's 435 South Kansas Avenue. This is the northwest corner of 4th and Kansas. Current owner and occupant is KS Commercial Real Estate on the 2nd floor, and Shauna Cakes is located on the Avenue Street level. This is the second of two drugstores listed next door to one another. Here's a better picture of that. You can see both drugstores side by side. This Roman influence design building was the home of the Brunt Drug Company from 1907 to 1912. Proprietors were John M. Brunt and Harlan Brunt, advertised as the Busy Drugstore. The Brunt brothers also occupied 201 West 6th Street following relocation from this corner to the 201 West 6th, just west of about 6th and Quincy. Moving across the river, 826 North Kansas Avenue. The former tenant at this address was Rusty Haggles Antiques, and it is now the Round Table Bookstore. And if the owners of the Round Table are on here, I apologize. I failed to get a good photo of your bookstore, but that's coming soon. This building was built in the late 1880s and was home to the Kane and Kendall druggists in 1891. In 1893, A.J. Kane partnered with W.D. Woodford, and in 1900, the business moved one door north to 832 North Kansas Avenue. .819 North Kansas Avenue, which is basically right across the street. The current tenant is Cabinetry Design and More. Located in Noto, this building was built in approximately 1880. A.J. Arnold was very active in the drug business in Topeka, having at least 6 different business partners over a span of 29 years from 1870 to 1899. A.J. Arnold's son, E.C. Arnold, took over the company upon A.J.'s death in 1899 and ran the company until 1912. In addition to the 819 North Kansas Avenue address, A.J. also occupied at other times or the same time the following properties: the 819 address, 821 North Kansas, 1000 North Kansas, 71 Kansas Avenue, 79 Kansas Avenue, 81 and 415 Kansas Avenue. The only thing I can figure out about AJ is he must not have gotten along with people very well since he had so many partners in a short period of time. And he must not have paid rent very well either, because he sure did hop around a lot. So moving from North Topeka to Central Topeka, (804) West 12th Street. The current business is the Zhong's Thai Kitchen, located on the corner of 12th and Taylor, which is the right-hand side of this building, and on the left-hand side is going to be 12th and Western. The original drugstore at this location was located in the west retail space, which you see it says Salon 808, and that 808 is the address. The original pharmacist or drugstore was the Nunemaker and Marklove, which was established in 1887 and ran through 1895. Nunemaker operated at this location and also at 526 South Kansas Avenue, selling the West 12th Street store to A.D. Rosser in 1895. Rosser was in business just 1 year before selling to a Mr. Lehman in 1896. Upon the sale, Rosser then joined his brother Thomas at 803 South Kansas Avenue. Lehman is noted as moving the store from the 808 address to the 804 address within the same building, which we know today as, again, as the Zhong's Thai Kitchen, which was formerly the Cafe Holiday. So once again, a lot of movement between druggists and also locations. In 1895, C.E. Joslin purchased the store from Lehman. Joslin operated the Joslin Drugstore until 1927, at which time he sold his interest to F.E. Pat Rowland under the business name of the Crescent Drugstore. Rowland remained in business until October of 1959, when he sold the business to Roy Jakewith. And I imagine there's plenty of you on this Zoom call that recognize that name or even patronized his business. So I believe Jakewith was in business up through the 1980s, if not a little later. Jakewith at this time had a pharmacy at the corner of 17th and Clay and proceeded to relocate the customer files from the Crescent Drugstore to the Jakewith Pharmacy the very same day and closed the West 12th location. (422 Southwest 6th Street). This is the northeast corner of 6th and South Topeka Boulevard. The current business at this location is Swims and Sweeps. This building was constructed in 1882 and occupied by 3 different druggists. In 1882, George Williams opened the Williams Pharmacy and had one of the first soda fountains in Topeka. It was a very popular place for the younger generation to gather and have a seltzer or fizz after school let out at Topeka High, which at this time, Topeka High was located at 8th and Harrison. Within the first year of operation, Williams partnered with Dr. E.A. Tuttle, and they continued operation of the drugstore under the Williams name until 1889. In that same year, William Kuntz purchased the store and ran it under the name of Kuntz Pharmacy. Kuntz operated at this location and 2 other locations on Kansas Avenue through 1907. But in 1905, Winfield Miller purchased the 6th and South Topeka Avenue location and changed the name to Miller's Pharmacy, and he was in business through 1912. 505 Southwest Washburn Avenue. Washburn Avenue was previously named West Street, but the current owner and tenant is now Capital Portfolio. This particular building is of great importance to the history of drugstores in Topeka. The original soda fountain, booths, cabinets, and pharmacy counter are still intact and can be seen at the Potwin Drugstore at historic Wardmead Park here in Topeka. If it weren't for a small group of Potwin residents dubbed the Potwin Place Redevelopment Corporation, the contents of this drugstore may have been dispersed among collectors or hauled off to the dump. If you haven't visited the Potwin Drugstore, it's worth your time. Definitely make an afternoon visit with some friends, have a root beer float, fountain soft drink, or better yet, a green river. NG Edelbutte contracted to have this property built in 1902 and spared no expense in its construction or furnishings. In 1936, Edelbutte contracted to have one of the very first refrigerated air conditioning systems installed here in Topeka in his drugstore. He operated the drugstore until 1944 when his son Richard took over the business. And in 1946, pharmacist Lloyd Raish purchased the business and by all indications kept the Edelbutte name. The drugstore changed hands again in 1968 and was purchased by Albert Wilson and renamed the Wilson Drugstore. Wilson operated the drugstore until the spring of 1978. Fortunately, Wilson and his predecessor, Lloyd Raish, kept the interior intact for future generations to enjoy and admire. So once again, I can't stress enough for you, just whether you care about these drugstores or not, go visit the Potwin Drugstore over at Wardmead Park. 1719 Southwest 10th Street. This building was actually raised about a year ago. This is the southeast corner of 10th and Mulvane, which would be catty corner from the Burger King at 10th and Mulvane. The Midwest Hearing Aid was the former occupant of the store before it was tore down. Built in 1909 and first occupied by Ren Wohler, who owned the Wohler Pharmacy. Wohler was in business only 3 years before selling to R.R. Schoaf, who had the Schoaf Pharmacy. It's unclear how long Schoaf was in business at this address, but this was definitely what we would have referred to as a neighborhood drugstore, as there was little to no other retail business in this area in the early 1900s. Well, let's see, we visited Central Topeka, North Topeka, Kansas Avenue. Let's skip over to Oakland and then also over to East Topeka. 948 Northeast Wabash. This is the southeast corner of Wabash and Thomas in the Oakland neighborhood. Oakland was first organized in 1886. One of the first drugstores was owned by George Ensign, the Ensign Drugstore. He operated at this location from 1905 to 1912, and he also operated a store at 304 Forest during this same time period. (1200) East 6th Street. This is the northeast corner of 6th and Lake. This property was most recently occupied by the Vaquero Boot and Hat Company. And in 1883, D.I. Ross had this building built for his pharmacy, Ross Drugstore. Ross was partners with Lehman Hall, and they operated from 1883 to 1912. In 1912, two sisters, Lottie and Lulu Kelly, can't make this stuff up, can you? Lottie and Lulu purchased the drugstore and named it the Kelly Drugstore. It is unclear as to how long they were in business at this address, but this was a rarity to have female pharmacists during this time. Downtown Kansas Avenue, from the river to Southwest 10th Street, had over 24 drugstore locations between 1858 and 1910. This would have amounted to 2.4 drugstores in each block. So here are some of the other notable locations on Kansas Avenue. 731 South Kansas Avenue, which is currently Marcel's Clothing. From 1878 to 1889, it was the Holmes Drugstore. And from 1889 to 1896, Holmes then went into business with Wagner, and it was called the Holmes and Wagner Drugstore. And then apparently Holmes left, and from 1896 to 1912, it was just the Wagner Drugstore. 935 South Kansas Avenue, which is currently Subway Sandwich Shop. From 1908 to 1910, Arthur Hargis operated the Hargis Drugstore, and A.O. Noel purchased the store in 1910 and operated the Noel Drugstore until 1912. So the building on the far left-hand side is the 935 South Kansas Avenue address that we're talking about. .115 Southeast 6th, formerly Hilmer's Luggage. Currently, it's Axe and Ale. Whoops. If the owners of Axe and Ale are on here, again, I haven't updated this image and hope to do that soon. But in 1909, Gilbert Pierce and William Milligan operated the Pierce and Milligan Drugstore. Very little found on this drugstore, and it's not known how long they were in business. 727 South Kansas Avenue. Current tenant is the Creations of Hope Gallery. Fred Place opened the Place Drugstore in 1888 and operated until 1891. This building is one of the last great architectural faces left on Kansas Avenue, and I sure hope it gets saved. 713 Kansas Avenue, currently vacant. L.S. Wolverton opened just one of his pharmacies at this location in 1907. Wolverton operated 5 different locations between 1887 and 1907. He sold this location to L.T. Price in 1908 and operated it until 1910. .1024 Southwest 6th Street. This is the northeast corner of 6th and Clay. The current owner is Pruitt Appliance. This building was constructed in 1887 by A.H. Merrill and operated as the Merrill Drugstore. He was in business from 1887 to 1902. Other notable druggists and drugstores of this era without a building left to admire are the Durant Drugstore, George Stanfield. He was in the 500 block of Kansas Avenue. I'm sorry, the 600 block of Kansas Avenue. Swift and Holiday. He was at a couple different locations. He was at 169 Kansas Avenue, and then later in the 400 block of Kansas Avenue. Swift and Holiday, 523 South Kansas Avenue. The Union Pacific Pharmacy, John Wand, who actually had a location here in Topeka and in Marion, Kansas. So he did double duty on his bottles there. That was pretty good thinking on his part. Matthew Waitman, Whiting and Washburn. W.H. Wilson. W.H. Wilson was on Southeast 4th Street. W.H. Snyder, Petro and Woodford, Post Office Drugstore, the Keene and Knowlton, Frank Hobart, Gatlin Drug Company, Chesterfield Pharmacy, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Hospital Association, which had their own drugstore, the J.C. Fulton Opera House Drugstore in North Topeka, W.R. Kennedy Druggist, which was located at the Throop Hotel, which I believe was where the current law enforcement center is at. Marshall Druggist. If you recall, Marshall had a band. He also was notable for treating the prostitutes in the neighborhood of their ailments then too. H.M. Leonard Windsor Drugstore and J.K. Jones Druggist. So as you travel the streets of Topeka, take a closer look at these buildings that we've been looking at here today, and as you pass them, ponder the proprietors that once toiled over their store and spent tireless hours to support their families selling their drugs, medications, and trusses, brushes, and balm. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well done. Of course, like normally, we'll have questions for Mark. Does anybody have anything? And if you do, don't forget to unmute your mic so that we can hear you. He's gone through a lot of places, and I think it's very interesting personally, but that has to do with the fact that my grandfather worked at 607 South Kansas for Fladden Marsh for a period of time. Questions?
I have a question, Mike. What about the pharmacists? Was there a licensure process for them, or could you just hang up your shingle?
I'm not sure what year that you actually had to have a pharmacy license. That's a good question. That's something I'll have to look into.
The one thing that you mentioned, Mark, initially was that this must have been profitable. Otherwise, why would you have a druggist? And of course, they sold everything in addition to drugs, right? I mean, your last pictures showed similar to what we see with Sam Walton's efforts of a variety store.
Absolutely. Some of the information that I found is they would have, along the front counter had similar items for sale, just as you would as you're in the checkout line at the grocery store or Walmart or any other store that we see today. As you're walking out, it's like, I need that, I need that, I need that. And so, yeah, and the fact that they moved around and partnered up so many times, I think it was profitable. Some of the druggists apparently just didn't get along with other people too well as far as partners. They had so many partners, and moving from one building to another seemed kind of strange as well. But some of them were in and out of business in short order. But the ones that did stick around, you find a lot of advertising pieces for them, and a lot of remnants as far as of the bottles that you saw. We find a lot of bottles, for certain drugstore companies that over a long period of time, which was an indication that they had done very well.
I think Diana has a question. And Mike, unmute your mic if you would, please. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a question. I have two comments. One is that I find it fascinating that these early drugstores sold artist supplies. I never would have thought of that. I find that fascinating. And the second thing is that when I lived in Portland in the 1960s, we called it Rach's Drugstore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
You obviously, Mark, I didn't mention it, and I think we're centered on profits. Is there any way of gauging who was very successful? I mean, it sounds like the ones that have been in business for 20 to 30 or 25 years probably were the most successful, and the ones that went out of business after a year weren't. But you don't have any recollection of how much money they made?
No, I have no idea. Some of the drugstore companies, well, the 6th and Kansas Avenue address for the Rowley brothers, 1 or 2 or 3, depending on which year you look at the company, they were on that corner for a long period of time. So I think that was an indication that they had done very well for themselves. The one thing I've not done to follow up on this is to go look at their personal residence and see where they resided. Quite honestly, a lot of the druggists actually lived in an apartment above the store, as probably a lot of retail establishments did back in the day.
The other thing that I always knew in our family was it sounded like Grandpa, who was a pharmacist, graduated from KU in 1914, worked long hours. I think the drugstores were open till 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night, catering to the people who went to movie theaters and wanted to have an ice cream concoction when they got out. This is in the mid-30s.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to, I noticed you talked about Sixth and Topeka had I guess they were the first ones to have one in Topeka and catered to the Topeka High students who left school in the afternoon.
Yeah, the soda fountain was something that came about in the late 1880s up through the 1890s, and of course lasted. Well, you can still find them today if you look hard enough. Cindy Higgins, she's from Eudora. She might be a good one for you to contact at some point in time. She's with the Kansas Humanities Council. She's on the speakers list, and she's got a great presentation on soda fountains in Kansas. And I think you would all really enjoy that. And she hits some of the drugstores here in Topeka and with their soda fountains as well. And I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you on here have been to a soda fountain, but a really good experience is, again, over at the Potland Drugstore.
I hate to keep talking because I'm sure somebody says I've got something better to say, but I know that my grandfather had a black book, which I've inherited, that showed the various concoctions that he had to make, because these pharmacists actually made these drugs with their operation. They didn't call
Right.
up Park Davis or Eli Lilly or whomever and say, send me a quantity of drugs and then I'll count out the pills and send them off. I think that if you didn't experience that, you should have been aware of that. And I would even think that maybe Dr. Pepper or Coca-Cola or Pepsi were they invented by druggists or pharmacists? I feel like I'll make that up, but anyway.
I believe so. And that was, I think, back in Atlanta, Georgia, is where Coca-Cola was first developed. And yeah, it was first sold through a pharmacy. It was. I not only collect Topeka and Kansas as a whole, but I also pick up some drugstore collectibles. And one of them is this. It's a dispensatory of the United States. And this one happens to date to 1882, I believe, 1888. But in here, you can see how thick this is. This would have been the pharmacist Bible at the time. So they would have gone to this, and of all the drugs that they had on the shelf, they would look to see what the doctor would have prescribed, and this would have assisted them in mixing that particular remedy for the patient. So yeah, you know, the amount of drugs that they would have kept on hand would have been enormous, you know, for a lot of the bigger druggists. And this book was invaluable for them to utilize to make their different prescriptions.
Questions? Anybody else have questions that might pertain? Again, yes, Diana, go ahead.
My paternal grandfather was a pharmacist in the Ukraine, in Dnepropetrovsk, which is now called Dnepro on the Dnieper River. He died in about 1919, but he was a college graduate. And not only did he make many drugs, of course, you could, you know, he didn't buy the pills, he made them all, but he also really functioned, as far as I can understand, almost like a physician's assistant. He not only sold the medicines, but he told patients what to take. And this was in the teens and early 20s, in what was then Russia and is now the Ukraine.
I think that was true here in the United States as well, that if you had an ailment, you could go to the pharmacist, and of course with the dispensary, he could look at it and see what your symptoms were, cross-reference it to his book, and actually hand a prescription to you over the counter.
Don't forget, doctors didn't have 4 years of training in addition to having a graduate degree. They had maybe a year or two, and so their training was different. So I can imagine that the pharmacists did have a lot more authority. Do you have anything to say, Mark, about Glenn Brinkley, Doc Brinkley from Milford, who would get on the radio in the 20s and early 30s and prescribe, oh, that element that this lady has explained to me needs number 32 and 46 and whatever else. He was a snake oil salesman that ran for governor. However, do you know anything about that?
Just what little bit I know about that is, I'm trying to think of Jerry's last name. He's from Lawrence. Once again, he's another speaker with the Kansas Humanities Council, and he's got a great presentation on Doc Brinkley. Yeah, what a quack he was. But yeah, he's referred to as the goat gland doctor. Mm-hmm. And so he was, his prescription was to take glands out of a goat and insert them into a male or a man in order to give him virility. So, but yeah, if you ever get the chance to hear, Jerry Harper is his name, Jerry Harper from Lawrence. Kudos go out to him. He's written a book and done a lot of research and has a great presentation on Doc Brinkley. But yeah, he was, I think he was handing out crazy prescriptions right and left to try to cure virility as well as about anything else out there. I think he also was treating people for cancer as well.
Mr. Edwards has a book, or was showing us to the screen. If you have it on there, yeah, go ahead and speak, please.
Is this backwards? Does it show up backwards? The printing?
No, it's okay.
No,
okay,
it's good.
I saved this book because it was my father-in-law was a physician, and he had this in his library, and this is my birth year, so I saved this book. But I was surprised to see the thickness of this when you showed that other source book, because I've always thought that this was unusually small. I mean, they still make the physician's desk reference, but it's 3 times this big, and it's probably not in print anymore. It's probably online, but it is interesting to look back and see some of these old print pages and just read about the various medications that are no longer available or have been found to be harmful and so forth. So I thought I'd share that with you.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
I remember going in the 50s to a drugstore and them having the drugstore counter and eating and that. And it was in the 50s, like I said, and it was about 3 buildings north of the northwest corner of 5th and Kansas, kind of across from the post office. But it wasn't the corner one that you showed. It was about 2 doors, and we always called it Jaime's. Do you know anything about it? Would have been late 40s and early 50s.
No, did you mention that to me last week, Kay, or maybe somebody else had mentioned that to me?
I didn't, but
okay.
I may have another time when I saw you, but or maybe I did. I can't remember. I wanted to, but I wasn't sure I did. But
yeah, my some of my presentation, as you witnessed today, runs up into the 1950s. But most of what I had focused on was 1858 up to approximately 1920, 1930. Yeah, I haven't taken it from there up into today's time. But yeah, somebody else had referenced that same location and same business name to me last week.
Well, it was probably me. I just forgot.
Any other questions or comments from anybody? Very interesting to me. Of course, I have some indirect or direct familiarity. You didn't mention anything about the Highland Park Pharmacy at 27th and Indiana. I did have a question about that earlier. I had a picture of it, and of course, I did the same thing many of our kids that went to Highland Park went over after junior high and got a soda or pop, just like others. I think now it's somewhat of a drug distribution center of some sort.
I think it is. I'm thinking that building was constructed in 1927. Do you know, Bob?
I do not know. I've got.
I think it was. I know the contents of the pharmacy, when the building changed hands about 10 years ago, a lot of the contents of the pharmacy ended up at some of the antique stores here in Topeka.
Okay.
But most of it dated back maybe to the 30s at the earliest. I think most of it was out of the 1950s. But yeah, I remember when it was open.
I was just gonna say, whoever was showing us that 1947 PDR, it might be that one reason why some of those medications or drugs that you see listed in there are not contained in contemporary PDRs is that they've been superseded by better drugs, not necessarily that they were terribly harmful.
I think you're probably right about that. I've been looking through here in the same book over the past 15, 20 minutes, and half the book is titled Therapeutic Indications Index. And you can look at the page and look up a disease process and find the medications that might be applicable. And the other half is dedicated to the medications themselves. But a lot of these names we wouldn't recognize anymore. I do see under general sedatives, for instance, it does list Donatol, which is still available under that name, which is and Nembutal and basic things like that. But most of these medications are not available anymore at all. And you're right, pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceuticals have come a long way, and a lot of new things have taken over the old time remedies. There was only one cure for gingivitis back then. It was Secon, whatever that is. Abbott made it.
I was thinking also about Dr. Brinkley, his successful quackery. It kind of shows you that if someone is very persuasive, they must be right.
Exactly. Yeah, and once again, to have that, to have a remedy that maybe promises youthfulness, for instance. I'm follically challenged here, so if I was looking for a hair remedy, and 150 years ago, and somebody hands me a bottle for $1 and says, well, this grows hair like crazy, and then they parade the 7 Sutherland sisters across the stage, and they've all got hair clear down to their ankles. It's like, well, gosh, if it'll do it for them, surely I'll get a little bit. And so once again, that's goes back to the snake oil salesman and the door-to-door salesman that would tell you anything that you wanted to hear.
My wife and I have been going down to Honduras for 20 years or so to do volunteer healthcare. And when we ride the local buses from one village to another, there's invariably a fellow who'll stand up in the aisle between bus stops. This isn't within the city. He'd have about 15 minutes to give his pitch, but he'd be selling some kind of snake oil. He claimed would be doing all kinds of fabulous things. And it was amazing how many people would buy it. I mean, these poor people would spend their money on snake oil that they buy off the street like that. But I guess hope springs eternal.
Any other comments or questions?
Bob, I'd just like to give a shout out and a thanks to Christine Steinkuhler for inviting me to present this, and I hope everybody enjoyed it today. The collecting part of this hobby is I'm very interested in, but the research and the sharing of it has become more of a passion. So anyway, thank you, Christine. Thank all of you for attending today.
Christine has done an excellent job of getting us a lot of different topics, and this is one. I wondered if you might, Mark, just take your camera like you did about 4 minutes before the program began and show us what you have of bottle collection. I don't know, I got the impression it's even bigger than this, but if you would, and maybe nobody's intrigued by it like I am, but please go ahead, talk about it.
My goodness.
This particular area of one wall is Kansas sodas, early sodas from statehood. Actually, there's some bottles in there marked Leavenworth City KT, Kansas Territory. These would have been all soda and then some beers. I've got another cabinet with about 3 times as many out in the other room. And then here are a lot of the Topeka drugstores, other drugstores from around the state, some patent medicines, same way with this cabinet as well. Let's see here. Up on top are a few Kansas City and St. Joe, Missouri beers. In this cabinet are stoneware jugs advertising liquor companies from Kansas. I don't know if you can see those, Peter Berry and Sons, which was in Leavenworth, John Baum. And there's some interesting stories behind some of these, in that they're also would have set up, on the Kansas River on the Missouri side during Prohibition to sell their liquor. Am I still with you?
Yeah, you sure are.
Okay.
Full screen so we can actually see the bottles and the names on it. For a while there, they're pretty small.
Okay.
No, don't worry about you. We took care of it. But you've got their system regulator in that yellow.
Yeah, the top shelf is Gabbets, which is which was a Topeka company, and they were a medical company. They also were bankers and brokers, and they had a printing company and an advertising company. So they were basically self-sufficient when it came to marketing. And I owe a deep debt of gratitude to Mike Worswick for part of this collection that he bequeathed to me after his passing last year. And then this shelf is a pretty good grouping of Leavenworth beers. And there's this one here is kind of cool. It's C.R. Jones and Company, Topeka, Kansas. And this is a liquor distributor that was right here in Topeka.
Have you found any of these bottles, or have you purchased them all, or have from other sources?
A combination of all. I buy, sell, trade. We dig a lot of these. This is Otto Keeney items here from North Topeka. So Yeah,
Didn't Teeny do pickles though?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Pickles, vinegar, ketchup. He did, there we go. Ketchup. Yeah, here's some other Otto Keeney. There we go. The pickle crocks. And one with a really nice applied label to it too, which is a whole nother presentation there in itself.
Thank you very much for doing that. I'm sure that might even generate some other questions. Chris has a question, I think, but thank you, Mark. That was great. Just kind of a bonus. Chris, do you have a question? You need to unmute.
Yes,
Well,
sir.
yeah, and Mark, Rick's sitting
wait,
here with me.
Just a
You
second,
know,
Chris.
Okay.
I was recognizing a Chris W.
Thank you for the presentation, Mr. Law and Mr. Toten. Forgive me if this was already answered, but were the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, and the Union Pacific and the Smith and Holiday, were those open to the public, or was it required that you be an employee or family member of the railroad?
I have no idea. The Swift and Holiday was a general public pharmacy where anybody could have walked into it, but the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, any of the railroad pharmacies, I'm not sure if they had to be an employee of the railroad or not. Good question.
Chris Steinkuhler, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
it's okay. Hi, Mark. How
Hi,
are
Chris.
you?
Good. How are you doing,
Good. Rick's
Hi,
here
Rick.
with me.
Rick?
Hey, Mark.
How you
Anyhow,
doing?
do you know when they started? Because, you know, the bottles to me seem pretty sturdy, pretty cool little bottles. When did they start, you know, doing the deposits and you return the bottles? And Rick tells me they just threw them all away. Is he right?
Well, most of everything that I've got, I'm not sure when deposits started. Now, I do have some of my early soda beers that say right on the back, it says this bottle to be returned or must be returned. One in particular that I've got, the guy actually operated out of a hotel room here in Topeka. And so his business was fairly short-lived because the type of bottle that he used a marble on the inside of it as the sealing device. So the kids were like, well, I'm not going to just return the bottle because there's no deposit on it, but I'm going to break the bottle open and get that marble out. So his business lasted only about as long as it took the kids to drink his soda water and then break the bottle and get the marble out of it. But I'm not sure when deposits started. I would think probably 1920s, maybe 30s. I know my mother-in-law, she passed away here 3 or 4 years ago, and she talked about not necessarily deposits, but just taking bottles back to the grocery stores when she was a kid just to make enough money to buy a few pieces of candy. That would have been in the 30s.
I noticed one of the containers you showed us that was in your liquor cabinet seemed to me to have a ground glass stopper or a glass stopper. And I would
Yeah.
think that would have been one they would want back.
Quite possibly.
Diana?
I just Googled it and it said that deposits on beer bottles started in the 1880s and on soda bottles in the 1920s.
Okay.
If Google is accurate about it, you know, you take that stuff with a grain of salt.
Sure.
It leads you to more research, but it gives you some ideas.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Well, Mark, I want to thank you very much on behalf of everybody. It's very interesting, and you did a very nice job of presenting it. And I feel like we got a bonus when we had the opportunity to see your bottle collection. So that's very, very good for us. Thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and hope everybody enjoyed enjoyed the presentation and learned something today. So thank you.
I think they did. Speaking of that, we do have another presentation next week with Michelle Cuevas Doublefield, who's working with the Greater Topeka Chamber of Commerce, or partnership, I guess is what it's called now. But she'll be talking about her grandmother, Teresa Cuevas, the founder of the Mariachi Estrella de Topeka mariachi band. And if you recall, back in 1981, I believe she and others were killed at the Hyatt Regency collapse of the Skywalks. And Michelle will be talking about that, same time, same station, as we say. And that will be our 39th presentation. Thank you all for being with us today. I think it's cold or rainy outside, so it's wonderful to have something to do inside. Mark, once again, thank you. Chris Steining, thank you very much for everything that you provide for us to have people like Mark join us. You folks have a great afternoon. Keep warm.